Happy to welcome back to the show Logan Phillips. He is the founder of Race the White House and does the whole election model forecasting beat. So thank you. Welcome. Glad to have you in the studio.
Good to see you, man.
Good to see you guys, too. Thanks very much for having me back on.
Of course. All right, so let's throw up the latest from your particular model and where things stand as of your latest update. So you have Kamala Harris with somewhat of a improved odds over Donald Trump. She's at a 61% chance of winning the Electoral College. Donald Trump at a 38.6% chance. What are some of the significant factors that go into these numbers, and how should people be looking at this? As she has a significant edge, or this is still more or less a toss-up race?
I would say that she definitely has an edge, but it's still highly competitive, right?
Yeah.
Like a baseball team that's winning 60% of their games is going to be seen as like a World Series frontrunner, and one that wins 40% of their games is not going to even be sniffing the playoffs. Nonetheless, right, 3 out of 5, it's not that big of an advantage.
Right.
No one's going to be surprised. Like, again, if we're using a sports team metaphor on any given day, that a team that wins 60% of their games loses, it's not exactly a shocker, right?
Yes.
So she has gained in the polls. And we were talking about this last time. There's just this dichotomy here, right? Where the state polls have been really good for her. Not amazing, but good for her. Where she's like a 2% or so lead in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Nevada. And it's basically tied to her being just a touch behind in Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona.
Right.
So, but we also have in the contrast of the electoral map in 2020 and 2016, where her, roughly 3% lead in the polls in the national vote wouldn't be enough to win. So we just don't know which is necessarily real here.
Yeah, good point. Let's put the next one, please, on the screen. This is the swing state snapshot. This one seems particularly important to me about the projected lead and the chance of winning. We want to talk specifically here about North Carolina. I believe Donald Trump only won it last time by, 75,000 votes? And within a percent or so.
It's like 1.5%.
Yeah, not significant. And nowadays, we have the Mark Robinson scandal, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in the show, but also in general, some of the competitiveness. Can you give us some insight into why that state seems more competitive this time around? What are the unique dynamics here?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this is a state that, if we look at it relative to the popular vote, even though it was only about 1.5 points off for Joe Biden, it still was a cycle where Joe Biden won the popular vote by like 4.5, right? So that's 6 points to the right of the nation.
Yeah.
And so the question is, has there been unique dynamics there enough to shift it in Democrats' direction so they can win? On the demographic standpoint, there have been people more from blue areas moving into North Carolina. So that gives them some opportunity. 2022 was a pretty good year for them, much closer than it was in 2020 relative to how the nation voted.
Yeah.
There could be some unique dynamics that make it a little different. Part of it might just be the message that sticks more. Voters like Harris more. But it's also, you have a North Carolina GOP that has gone very far to the right since they've gotten a supermajority on banning abortion and pushing policies that are much more of a safe red type
like Alabama
politics.
Behavior in a swing
Exactly.
state. Yeah.
And so has that repelled voters enough? Maybe a little bit, yeah. I mean, the hard thing with the president, especially these days, is they're just so front and center in people's minds more than governor races are, that like normally it's the top that affects everything else down.
Yeah.
The question is, with Robinson, is he so extreme and viewed so negatively that maybe he brings in even a few extra voters that otherwise wouldn't have to vote against him? If that's the case, it could end up hurting Donald Trump.
Yeah, so for people that don't know, Mark Robinson, who is the Republican nominee for governor and who is the current lieutenant governor, CNN uncovered comments from a porn website called Nude Africa. We're going to cover this in depth later if you're curious for more of the details. But among many other things, he self-described as a, quote, black Nazi. This also, he is famous for a number of very controversial or out-and-out offensive statements, including really dabbling in some Holocaust denialism, which makes the whole black Nazi thing maybe not as shocking as it could be. But what is the history when it comes to, quote unquote, reverse coattails? So the idea would be that Trump is dragged down even maybe a little bit by the fact that he's sharing a ballot with this incredibly extreme, incredibly unpopular candidate who is running for governor.
Yeah, I mean, you're right that he's extremely unpopular. He was down by almost 10% before this broke out.
Right.
And I think Google Trends show that people are searching Mark Robinson 4,000% more. And so he's going to get a lot
I wonder
worse.
why.
So I think he's going to lose by a lot more than 10, personally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so then let's talk about that. Who is the candidate out there? Who is Robinson running against?
Josh Stein.
Okay, so who is the Stein Trump voter? All right, so because these people exist. If we think about, Pennsylvania, Mastriano lost by much more than Dr. Oz did. So somewhere out there are tens of thousands of Shapiro Dr. Oz voters. Like, who are the, give us the demographic profile of these types of folks.
Well, I think that we think these, you know, if you're looking at Donald Trump as someone maybe that doesn't like him or that's even in the middle, he seems a lot weirder to you than he does to Trump voters. They just don't necessarily view his crazy things that he says as nearly as crazy, right?
That's true.
Maybe because he came in as a reality TV show character and had a penchant of saying those things beforehand. But when anyone else says those things, and Robinson has said a lot worse, then they get held to a different standard.
Right. Like Carrie Lake. Yeah,
exactly.
We see that as well. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, very interesting. What do you make of the fact that North Carolina seems to be a little stronger for Kamala Harris than Georgia is, when obviously it was the reverse for Joe Biden last time around? What are the different demographic strengths that she has in particular? Or is it, like you pointed out, that you've had an influx of voters to the state of North Carolina that are more favorable to Democrats?
Well, I would say on Georgia's front, they're having even more of those voters. It's why the state is moving at such a rapid pace towards Democrats. Well, first I would say this is kind of what we think based off the polls, but last cycle it really looked like Georgia was going to move to the right of Florida and North Carolina.
Oh, interesting.
And it just zoomed to the left because the polls missed everywhere else but Georgia. So it's probably going to be a little bit to the right of North Carolina, but they're still really close. So I'm not completely sold on that necessarily.
Right.
In regards to Georgia specifically, you know, I think there's a few more white college educated voters in North Carolina. That is an area Democrats continue to gain. I think relative to Joe Biden, Harris is just doing much better with non-white voters, particularly Latino voters.
Yeah.
So the slippage looked like we could have as big of a drop-off maybe from 2020 to 2016. Instead, maybe it's steady sailing from 2020.
One of the analyses I saw, I wish I could remember who, I'm sorry, my brain doesn't work that well, but I do remember reading that in North Carolina, Joe Biden actually did really well with black voters, and there's a significant black population in North Carolina. But compared to his national numbers among suburban voters, he underperformed a bit in North Carolina. So if you just had those suburban voters moving to, you know, what he did with the rest of the country, that would probably be enough to make up the difference. And so, you know, as all things are sort of national and there's like this, you know, just kind of national movement in the suburbs towards Democrats, you could see where that dynamic too in North Carolina could be shifting things more considerably towards Harris.
Yeah, especially now that abortion is far more front and center than it was in 2020.
That's a great point, yeah.
And North Carolina's gone so extreme on the GOP front on the issue of abortion that it could turn off some of those voters.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Issues-wise, one of those shocks in 2022 was that Democrats massively overperformed because of the issue of abortion. Some of the GOP response on that is like, well, it's been 2 years, things have calmed down. Do you think that's true? Like when you look at, you know, splits on issues and other things, and how should we gauge like what issues the campaigns are running on, what their level of import is? People say it's the economy stupid, sometimes abortion this time around. How can we gauge that going in?
I think for most voters, it's going to be a combination. Most voters aren't single issue voters. But we've seen Democrats have been losing on the economic issue most of recent elections. They lost in 2012, they lost in 2016, they lost in 2020. They still did pretty well overall in those elections. And in 2022, they lost on that pretty badly too, and they had the best midterm, one of the best midterms of any party since JFK. So all these other issues are so important that Democrats still have a real clean pathway to victory.
Got it.
But I would say abortion is probably less important than 2022. It's still incredibly important. It's just hard to beat the year where Roe v. Wade was overturned.
That's a good point.
That's true. And last question for you is, how many undecided voters are there? I mean, are people just basically locked in and we're just looking at like a nail-biter 50-50 election until election day? Or do you think there's still a chance for some sort of significant swing in either direction?
Less so than normal, but you know, for anyone that's in DC or that follows politics closely, it is impossible to understand how this happens. But I think there are a lot of people out there that they're focused on other things. They might think it's important enough to vote, but not important enough to follow until right before they make their decision. And then there's always the other types of undecided voters that we don't really call undecided voters. They're the sometimes voting Democrats, the sometimes voting Republicans, and something can cause them to go show up or not show up in the polls. I think that's what Democrats are hoping maybe happens with Robinson, that he just discussed people too much who maybe are voting for Trump but find the process annoying enough, and this is like the last straw for them. I'm not sure if those will exist or not, but it's certainly possible.
It's like a suppressive vote almost, like a disgust, like I'm not going to
I'm just not going to mess with those.
I can see it.
Yeah.
All right, let's put B3, please, up on the screen, because I found this pretty interesting about the Democrats' largest gains in the last 14 days. You have Pennsylvania, Colorado, New Hampshire, North Carolina.
Sure, they like to see Pennsylvania.
Yeah, they like to see Pennsylvania there. So Pennsylvania has been effectively tied here. Can you give us some insight into who these people are that are gaining, that Harris is gaining in Pennsylvania? What demographic profile?
That's a little hard to say this early, but I can tell you why I think Pennsylvania switched.
Okay.
Debate viewership was high across the board. No state was at higher, as far as we can tell from TV ratings, than Pennsylvania.
It was in Philly,
interesting.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the debate was in Philly.
Well, that's good for Harris. She's got
Yeah.
a lot of voters in the Philly area.
Yeah,
Right.
and so Philadelphia and Pittsburgh were the two metro areas that had the highest ratings of any in the entire country.
Oh, interesting.
And so I don't think it's a coincidence that she's gained as much there. You know, we're seeing that like she had a bigger bump in the national polls than she had in other states, excluding Pennsylvania, where they track pretty closely. And I think that's because these voters have been a little more locked in, maybe not by their choice, but by the onslaught of ads.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I lied. I do have one more question for you. We showed earlier the video of, these long lines in Fairfax County and Saugars and Alexandria.
Yes.
Saw the long lines there in Virginia. These are like, tend to be white, liberal, educated, voting for Democrats type of people. And, I saw a lot of people on Twitter like making a lot out of like, oh, the surge is here for Kamala, et cetera, et cetera. Do you make anything of those sorts of images, numbers, et cetera, or do you just completely discard? Do you take that data seriously or even find it to be relevant whatsoever?
Oh man, this stuff gets so cherry-picked that it's really hard to judge. I mean, if you're a Democrat, yeah, that's exciting, but it's not that exciting because it's
like a blue area.
Yeah. I mean, it's also DC folks who,
hyper engaged.
Yeah, the right to vote is sacred for them.
Yeah.
We wish it was that sacred for everyone in America, but I think people take it for granted to a degree.
Yeah.
The other thing is, you're going to hear a lot about comparing turnout to 2020 or even to 2016. I wouldn't do that because our electorate has changed so much since then. Early voting is way more common, but it's going to be way less common than 2020, especially by mail because we're not in a pandemic anymore. So we don't really have any point of comparison.
Good point. All right. Well, there you go. Who knows? We'll find out. All right. Thank you. We appreciate talking to you.
Thank you. That was great. Yeah, we appreciate
thanks,
it.
guys.
Please come back.
Yeah, our pleasure.
We'll see you soon.
Anytime.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.